A tight, unsettling shot of a child's hand, small and pale, gripping the cold, rough stone of a castle windowsill. A faint, distant echo of metal on metal, the sound of swords. The camera slowly pulls back, revealing a 12-year-old girl, her eyes wide with a fear that is too adult for her face. Outside, the world is burning. Banners of a foreign king flutter in the wind, red and black against a gray sky. The air itself feels heavy with the promise of blood and conquest. The camera focuses on the girl again, her breath misting the glass in a fragile cloud. This is not a princess in a fairy tale. This is the last duchess of a dying nation. You think you know what history is. A collection of dates, names, and sanitized stories sold to you in schoolbooks. But history is a living, breathing thing, a wound that never truly heals. And some wounds, some stories, are so dark they're locked away, hidden from view for a reason. This is one of them. This is the story of Anne of Brittany, a child queen whose life was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a story so raw it will change the way you see power forever. Picture this, a proud, independent Celtic nation on the brink of extinction. Its last hope? A 12-year-old girl. Anne's father, Duke Francis II, is dead, and the vultures have already begun to circle. The Kingdom of France, a hungry, expanding empire, sees this land not as a home, but as a prize to be conquered. The Holy Roman Emperor, a man of endless ambition, sees Anne herself as nothing more than a pawn in a geopolitical chess game. She's not a person. She is a commodity. An asset. A living, breathing piece of property to be traded, inherited, and conquered. The world she inhabits is a brutal machine, and it has no room for the innocence of a child. It will not care about her hopes or her fears. It will not care that she should be playing games, not standing on a parapet watching her world crumble. Her value is calculated in kingdoms, not in happiness. And her purpose is not to live, but to serve, to be a bridge, a bargaining chip, womb to secure the future of others. The story you're about to hear is not just about a queen. It's about the raw, visceral nature of power itself. The kind that crushes a person and then forces them to smile and wear a crown, visual, a quick, jarring sequence of shots. A royal seal being stamped with brutal force. A map of Europe, with an expanding red stain of French influence. A close-up of a marriage contract, the parchment crinkling ominously. The camera lingers on a young woman's face, tear-streaked but with a new, hardened glint in her eyes. It cuts to a long, empty stone corridor, the sound of her footsteps echoing alone. Anne's first act as queen was a desperate attempt to reclaim her own destiny. At 13, she made a move that was as defiant as it was dangerous. In a secret, shadowy ceremony, she married the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian by proxy. The emperor wasn't even there. A stand-in held her trembling hand as she spoke vows to a man she'd never met in a language she barely understood. This was not a romance. It was a shield, a gamble to protect her country from the overwhelming power of France. But as you'll soon learn, paper shields are useless against iron swords. The French king, Charles VIII, was barely older than Anne herself. And he was not about to let his prize slip away. He unleashed his armies upon Brittany, a tidal wave of steel and fire that swept across the land. The siege of Rennes was a masterclass in psychological pressure. Day after day, the French noose tightened. Food grew scarce. Hope faded. And Anne, a 15-year-old girl, stood on the battlements, watching the enemy banners multiply on the horizon like a deadly rash. She must have believed her powerful new husband, Maximilian, would come to her aid. He never came. The promises of emperors are as fleeting as shadows in the brutal world of realpolitik. Anne was discovering a profound, painful truth: in this game, promises made to teenage girls are worth less than the parchment they're written on. Her brilliant plan had failed. The siege ground on, and the choice became stark, cold, and brutal. Surrender and save her people, or watch them starve for the sake of a kingdom that had already been lost. She chose surrender. But the price was savage. The conqueror, a king just 2 years her senior, didn't want just the land. He wanted her. He wanted to own her, to possess her, to absorb her very being into his empire. He wanted her to marry him, visual, a wedding procession, but the shots are claustrophobic and unsettling. Close-ups of gold and jewels, but the camera lingers on Anne's hollow, distant eyes. The sound is muffled, as if underwater. The camera focuses on the moment she places her hand in Charles's, a gesture of submission that is both grand and terrifying. A brief, jarring shot of a locked door, then silence. The wedding was a theatrical display of conquest. On December 6, 1491, Anne was led into the Cathedral of Tours, not as a bride, but as a prize. She was barely 16. Charles VIII was just 21. Every detail of the ceremony was designed to be magnificent, to obscure the dark truth of what was happening. Cloth of gold, precious stones, hundreds of witnesses, but Anne's eyes were hollow, reflecting the cold stone of the cathedral walls. She wasn't just marrying a king. She was signing the death warrant of Breton independence. And the terms of the marriage contract were a masterclass in institutional cruelty. The document stipulated that if Charles died before her, she would be required to marry his successor. She wasn't just becoming a queen. She was becoming a hereditary asset of the French crown, a tool to be passed from one king to the next. The girl who had once stood defiantly on the ramparts of Rennes was now legally forbidden from ever escaping French control. She was a living shackle, a chain binding her people to their conquerors. Their wedding night was not a celebration. It was a final, intimate act of subjugation. What happened in that ornate chamber at Château de Languillas was not love. It was conquest in its most personal form. But Anne was a survivor, forged in the fires of loss and betrayal. And within months, she was pregnant. The French court celebrated, rejoicing that the union of France and Brittany was now cemented. But for Anne, it must have been a complex mixture of emotions. Hope for a son who might give her some measure of power. Fear for what carrying her conqueror's child meant for her soul. And the devastating knowledge that she was now truly trapped. The child was born dead. And with that single, heartbreaking event, a pattern was set that would define the rest of her life. Hope, followed by crushing loss. Pregnancy, followed by a grief that was both personal and political. She had entered a psychological prison, and the walls were closing in. A time-lapse of a woman's silhouette, growing older in an ornate bed chamber. Each new pregnancy is marked by a brief, hopeful shot of a child's crib, which then becomes empty. This is interspersed with shots of a man in armor, riding away into the distance, his back to her. The tone is somber, reflective, and full of unspoken pain. Anne's life became a brutal, repetitive cycle. She would endure at least 14 documented pregnancies. Most ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. This was not just a personal tragedy, it was a psychological and political torment. In a world where a queen's worth was measured by her ability to produce male heirs, each loss was not only a moment of devastating grief but also a political failure. Imagine the mental toll. Each new pregnancy brought with it the possibility of securing her position, of giving France the heir it desperately wanted, of finally proving her worth. And each loss was another mark against her in the ruthless ledger of royal expectations. Her husband, Charles VIII, was largely absent, obsessed with his grand, and ultimately failed, military campaigns in Italy. While he played at being a conqueror in foreign lands, and was left to rule France. She was forced to take on the burdens of a kingdom while still grieving the deaths of her own children. It was during this period that she began to transform. The terrified girl who had been forced into marriage slowly became a master of quiet power. She learned to manage the court, to navigate the treacherous currents of French politics, to build her own networks of influence. She was a queen without a kingdom, a mother without children, but she was no longer a pawn. She was a player. She was learning to use the very system that had broken her against itself. And then, fate intervened in a way no one could have predicted. In 1498, Charles VIII, the man who had conquered her and forced her into marriage, walked through a low doorway at Château d'Amboise and struck his head. He collapsed and died within hours. The king was dead at 27, leaving behind no surviving children. And just like that, Anne was free. But a profound new terror soon replaced her grief. According to the terms of her cruel marriage contract, she was now required to marry his successor, Louis XII. The conqueror was dead, but the prison remained. Her new husband would be her old enemy. The cycle of control was about to begin again. A tight shot of a woman's face, etched with a newfound determination. We see her observing a scene from a distance, two figures, a man and a woman, arguing in a sunlit courtyard. A subtle, quick shot of a papal document, its seal glowing. The camera holds on Anne's face, a slow smile playing on her lips, a mixture of grim satisfaction and cold calculation. But Louis XII, the new king, presented a problem. He was already married to a pious, gentle woman named Joan of France. A marriage that had lasted 22 years. The solution, in the grand tradition of institutional manipulation, was typically ruthless and cynical. Louis would seek an annulment from the Pope, claiming his marriage was invalid from the start. And Anne was forced to watch it all. She watched as Joan, a woman who had done nothing but serve her husband faithfully, was dragged through a public humiliation. She saw Joan's intimate details and physical state debated by church lawyers, her character assassinated to pave the way for Anne's next marriage. And saw her own future played out in Joan's present. She realized, with a chilling clarity, that royal women weren't people. They were problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, resources to be redistributed. The institution of the monarchy, the church, and the state were all cogs in a machine designed to control and suppress women, to strip them of their identity and reduce them to a function. She saw that she was not unique. She was part of a pattern, an ancient, forbidden design. She understood that power, true power, does not lie in a crown. It lies in the ability to manipulate the system from within. When Joan was finally cast aside and sent to a convent, and knew she was staring at her own potential fate. But Anne had learned something. She had discovered that even trapped queens could wield power, if they were clever enough. And when Louis XII came to claim her as his bride, she was no longer the terrified teenager she had once been. This time, she negotiated. She was no longer a victim. She was a master strategist, and she had a price. A price that would change the course of history and begin to dismantle the system that had tried to destroy her. She would have autonomy. She would have a say in the succession. She would not be forced to marry a third time. She had learned to use her value as a political asset to carve out small, but vital, spaces of autonomy within her gilded prison. For those of you who understand that history is more than stories, that it's a blueprint for the human condition, let me ask you to do something. To lock in this awakening, this transformation of your own perspective, type the phrase, "the Queen's shadow," in the comments. Do it now. And then, do it again. 2 times. This act will acknowledge the shadow of history that follows us all, and the power we find in bringing it to light. It's a small act of defiance against the sanitized narratives we've all been fed, the wedding to Louis XII. This time, Anne's face is not one of fear, but of cold calculation. The camera moves between her and Louis, showing a silent, power-filled exchange. We see her signing a document with a confident, deliberate hand. The shots of her court are vibrant and full of her influence, women reading, scholars debating, artists at work. She's not just queen, she's a patron, a builder, a force. The wedding to Louis XII in 1499 was a starkly different affair. Anne was now 22. She was no longer the trembling child who had been forced to marry Charles VIII. She was a queen who had buried children, ruled a kingdom, and survived the machinations of European politics. When she placed her hand in Louis's, it was not an act of surrender, but a confirmation of a hard-won negotiation. Louis, for his part, proved to be a different kind of husband. Where Charles was brutal and impulsive, Louis was calculating and patient. He understood that and was not just a wife to be possessed, but a political partner whose cooperation was essential to his reign. Their marriage, while still fundamentally coercive, developed into something that resembled mutual respect. And threw herself into her new role with a fierce determination. She created a court culture that blended French sophistication with the traditions of her beloved Brittany. She established patronage networks that extended her influence throughout the kingdom, becoming a force in the world of art and scholarship. She began the delicate work of ensuring that Brittany retained its unique identity, even as it was absorbed into the French realm. But the ghosts of her lost children haunted every moment. Every new pregnancy brought a familiar mix of hope and terror. She had learned to manage her expectations, to prepare for loss, even as she prayed for success. The psychological armor she had developed was impressive but heartbreaking, a woman who had trained herself not to hope too much for her own children. And then, in 1501, she gave birth to a daughter, Claude. The child lived, thrived, and became the light of Anne's life. For the first time in years, Anne experienced the profound joy of successful motherhood. But even this happiness was tinged with political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the son that France desperately needed. Anne's subsequent pregnancies followed the familiar, brutal pattern of loss. Sons who lived only days, daughters who never drew a breath, the endless cycle of hope and grief that defined her life. Each loss was not just a personal tragedy but a state crisis, another failure in her primary duty as queen, a slow-motion sequence of a child, Claude, playing in a garden. The shot is beautiful but poignant. The camera cuts to Anne watching her daughter, her face a complex mix of love, pride, and sadness. The sound is a quiet, ethereal score. We see Anne at a desk, writing letters, meeting with architects, commissioning art. She is not just a mother, she is building a legacy, a bulwark against the oblivion of time. Without a male heir, the succession remained uncertain, a constant threat to everything Anne had fought for. Her perceived failure to produce sons was whispered about in court, seen by some as a divine judgment, a sign that the union of Brittany and France was not blessed by God. Courtiers and foreign ambassadors watched her every move, sending coded messages to their masters. The weight of an entire kingdom's future pressed down on her shoulders. But Anne had learned to find power in unexpected places. If she couldn't produce a male heir, she would shape the world through her actions. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning magnificent works that celebrated Breton culture and history, ensuring that the soul of her homeland would not be forgotten. She established schools and hospitals, creating institutions that would outlast her own life. She carefully managed her daughter Claude's education, ensuring that the girl would be prepared for the brutal realities of royal life. And wasn't just reacting to her circumstances, she was shaping them. She had been a chess piece, but now she was moving the board. She was a master of psychological warfare, turning her perceived weaknesses into strengths. Her grief became a motivation, her losses a fuel for her ambition. She was building a future, not just for herself, but for a culture she refused to see extinguished. She had been reduced to a function, a wife, a mother, a political tool. But she had reclaimed her identity by finding power in her pain. She had been stripped of her agency, but she had built a new one brick by brick, document by document, institution by institution. She was a queen of a kingdom that no longer existed, a mother of children who had never lived, but she was more powerful than most kings who had ever sat on a throne. She was a living testament to the fact that true power is not given, it is taken, it is built, and it is forged in the deepest fires of suffering. In 1513, and faced her final and greatest test. Louis XII, now 52 and in poor health, was contemplating remarriage after Anne's death to secure the succession. The king, who had promised to honor their marriage contract, was already making contingency plans that would undo everything Anne had fought for. The system, relentless and unforgiving, was once again attempting to reclaim its asset. It was a betrayal as old as time, the promise of a man against the cold, hard logic of dynastic politics. Anne's response was swift, decisive, and brilliant. She arranged for Claude, her beloved daughter, to be betrothed to Francis of Angoulême, Louis's heir presumptive. It was a political masterpiece. By ensuring that her daughter would marry the next king, and was securing both Claude's future and Brittany's continued connection to the French throne. If Anne couldn't produce sons, she would at least ensure that her daughter's sons would rule. The system that had sought to destroy her would now be forced to carry her legacy forward. The effort exhausted her. Years of political maneuvering, repeated pregnancies, and the constant stress of royal life had taken their toll. Anne's health began to fail in the winter of 1513. She was only 36, but she had lived several lifetimes' worth of tragedy and struggle. As she lay dying in the Château de Blois, Anne must have reflected on the impossibility of her situation. She had been forced to marry 3 times, had endured 14 pregnancies, had watched most of her children die, and had sacrificed her homeland's independence on the altar of political necessity. Yet, she had also negotiated unprecedented autonomy for a royal woman. She had preserved elements of Breton culture. She had secured her daughter's future. The irony was profound. Anne, who had spent her life being passed from one husband to another, who had been treated as property rather than a person, had somehow managed to become one of the most powerful women in European history. She had found a way to win a game that was rigged from the start. Anne's legacy is not found in the grand monuments of France, but in the subtle, hidden truths she unearthed. Her life was a blueprint for institutional manipulation and psychological control. The forces that sought to crush her, the political alliances, the religious justifications, the patriarchal systems, are the same forces that operate in our world today. They have simply changed their names and their faces. They are in the algorithms that shape your thoughts, the media that controls your narratives, and the systems that dictate your worth. Anne's story is a mirror. It shows us that true freedom is not the absence of chains, but the conscious awareness of them. What Anne taught us, what she had to learn through a lifetime of suffering, is that the powerful will always attempt to define you. They will try to reduce you to your function, to your utility, to your perceived value. But true self-mastery is the ability to refuse that definition. It is the ability to find power and purpose not in the role they assign you, but in the truth you discover for yourself. Anne was supposed to be a tool, a vessel, a pawn. But she became a queen in the truest sense of the word, a ruler of her own destiny, a shaper of her own legacy. She stands as a testament to the fact that even when the entire world is arrayed against you, even when the deck is stacked, and the rules are rigged, you still have a choice. You can surrender to the game, or you can learn to play it better than anyone else. You can become the master of your own truth, the architect of your own life. Her story is not just history. It's a key. A key that unlocks the door to a deeper understanding of the world you inhabit. A key that shows you the hidden mechanisms of power, the subtle ways you are being controlled, and the immense strength you possess to break free. We began with a story of a child queen, a tale of a girl's impossible fight against the largest forces in Europe. But what we've discovered is something much more profound. We've peered behind the curtain of history and seen a system in action. A system that uses marriage, religion, and power to control individuals and entire nations. We have seen how a girl was turned into a weapon, a commodity, and a symbol of conquest. But we have also seen how she learned to wield that weapon herself. Her story is not a cautionary tale. It is a manual. A forbidden text on how to survive and thrive when the world is designed to break you. And of Brittany was the child queen, forced to marry her executioner. But in the end, she wasn't his property. She was his equal. She wasn't a victim. She was a master of her own fate. She wasn't a symbol of French conquest. She was a monument to Breton resistance. And she wasn't just a queen of a dead kingdom. She was the architect of a dynasty. The knowledge you have just received is dangerous. It cannot be unseen. It cannot be unheard. It changes your perspective forever. You are no longer just a viewer. You are now a witness. You have stepped into the shadow of history, and you have heard the truth whispered from the grave. The question now is, what will you do with it? Will you let this knowledge change you? Will you see the world with new eyes, and recognize the systems of control for what they are? Will you become a master of your own destiny, or will you remain a pawn in someone else's game?